I love stories. I love stories, especially on Hanukkah, because I grew up with very little, but what we did have were stories. I have built a very different life for myself than the world I was raised in. I was raised in a very religious and a very traditional world. But one thing that I have tried to bring into my own life and share with my son has been the tradition of stories I grew up with. And today I want to do the same for all of you on this very special holiday and share with you a story that I wrote about my own life, piece of memoir about my memories of the holiday Hanukkah. It's titled Circumcised Hanukkah Gifts. Every Hanukkah, when I was young, my father would bring home the same gift, a new stereo. And as soon as the present was pulled out of the box, it was mutilated. It was usually long into the night of Hanukkah when he would finally arrive home from menorah lighting. How we waited. We children sat at the dining room window for hours. We jumped up with every black-bearded silhouette that came around the bend at a distance. Our block was kind of like wounding, and he would come from a distance. And after a brief and furious debate among us children, was it Tati or was it not, we conceded that it wasn't him. So we went back to waiting. Our window looked out to the Satmar Drive cul-de-sac. Our street was in the heart of the village of Kiryas Joel, which is an enclave of Satmar Hasidic Jews that is situated about an hour north of New York City. When I was born in Kiryas Joel in 1985, the village was not even 10 years old, but it already boasted a shopping center, my girls' school, and the majestic central synagogue of white stone. The houses wound through the sloping hills of through streets and dead ends, each house built alike, with 4 apartments and balconies in the front, but different colored siding for each home. Some were coffee brown, or off-white, or soft yellow, and ours at number 48 was light beige. We were at apartment 202 in there. Our streets had names like Rapschitz Road and Sigurd Court, Yiddishized names of towns and villages in Eastern Europe. Once, before the Holocaust, these faraway towns were the thriving hearts of pious Hasidic centers. Most of the Hasidic followers were murdered in the Holocaust, but some survived, and those were our grandparents. Our Zaydis and Bubbies left their blood-soaked homelands for the dangerous secular lands of the West, where the survival of their bodies were not at risk, but it was the survival of their souls they so feared. In New York, they created a safe cocoon, away from the melting pot and threats to faith. They built a village 20,000 people strong, well today it's more than 30,000, where we spoke Yiddish and dressed in long sleeves and tights, where we had a Hasidic government and a Hasidic Yiddish newspaper and a lively and modest girls' school, and where every family had babies and kids enough to fill the entire cul-de-sac with delighted screams during summer evenings. On Hanukkah nights, though, we looked out to Satmar Drive to the dead end from the big dining room window of apartment 202, our apartment perched on a little green hill, and it was just dark and cold and quiet outside. Our home, though, was rich with smells of sweet cheese latkes and fried fish, with warmth and innocence. Here we knew nothing of the Western world we lived in, not of Michael Jackson or I Love Lucy or Charles Dickens or Charles Darwin or women's suffrage or college or careers. These are just some examples. We knew very little of the secular world. All we saw when we looked out were homes like ours, homes and their families. The homes formed a circle around a street lamp. The lamp was how we knew if snow was falling, if, to our delight, school might be canceled tomorrow, if, to our delight, we might go out and shovel and sled down the hill. As we sat and waited for my father at this window, we saw dining room shades get pulled open by the Lefkowitzes, the Clars, the Signs. The first floor, the second floor, at number 47, at number 51. Slowly, all shades opened. Families gathered at all windows. They all did pretty much the same. They set up menorahs with candles and oil, then turned off the lights. At the din of candlelight, they lit one menorah, then another. We saw the Steinmetz men dance in a circle near the flames. We saw the Clark grandmother nod off in her wheelchair with her handkerchief falling over her eyes. We saw the Schwartzes sit by the window and watch the wax drip away. Neighbors were talking and eating and singing with little children on adult laps. But our father was still on the bus home. On some nights, we waited for him so long that all the neighbors' menorahs burnt out, their curtains were drawn again, and the neighborhood went into a deep sleep. And we waited. On all 8 Hanukkah nights, our dining room's windowsill sat covered in sloppy layers of silver foil. It protected the paint from the little menorahs that dripped grease and wax. We had one for each boy in the family, and there were many boys. By the time my mother was done having babies, we were 9 boys and 6 girls, 15 children altogether. I was the 5th child, the freckled tomboy who felt always constrained by girlhood. The girls didn't have menorahs, that's just how it was. It didn't stop us from having loud opinions about the clashing color choices our brothers had made for the candles in their menorahs. And so we argued and debated, our stomachs growling, while waiting for the Williamsburg bus to finally drop my father off out of sight a few blocks away, and waiting for him to come walking around the bend, maybe even carrying a big box wrapped in a plastic bag. This happened years before my father would become one of the community's most powerful figures. In my youth, before he built an important community organization that made him and our family one of the community's important families, we were very plain and very poor. Back then, he owned a sock factory in the city. He traveled an hour and a half by bus to work every day, at the very least. With traffic, it was much longer. I remember his factory vaguely. There was a high-low and an enormous warehouse. I remember it was cold in there. He took us a few times, and by then, manufacturing was no longer viable. Socks were cheaper to import, and Goodyear hosiery was going under. I took it for granted that we were poor. It didn't bother me at all that my smock dresses and black or white tights I wore were inherited from my sisters. But it was hard on all of us to wait for him on Hanukkah night. It was hard for us to sit there at the window when all the neighbors were already in bed with full bellies. My mother would often tell stories to pass the time. She was too pious to allow us to eat the special Hanukkah meal before candle lighting ceremony. You're supposed to wait until you light candles before you eat dinner. Yet she was also too sensitive to withstand our endless complaints. She had such soft hands, and she let us stroke them as she wove her tales. She told stories. They were always feel-good stories of little boys who had been bad or had been crippled, who by virtue of Jewish kindness or Jewish guilt or some other Jewish heroism had a beautiful moment of redemption. My mother gave us her precious time often, but never as a friend. She was an adult and we were kids, and we had always better mind our business and not talk out of turn. My mother wasn't naturally an authoritative figure. She just existed in the adult orbit to which we children were not invited, where gossiping neighbors and aunts opened wide-eyed if children dared to say too much. I was often ashamed for my friends to see my mother because she was pregnant so often. It somehow made me feel like she was more run-down, less stylish woman for it. But when my mother slowly unwrapped the climax of the story, when little Shmili showed his surprised parents that after many years of being unable to walk, he could now take steps, I cried without shame. My heart was so full of love for my mother then, who, like me, loved a good story. My father was less consistent. He was usually powerfully intimidating, too busy to have time for us, but when he was in the mood, he spent his precious time explaining mutual funds to us, and he'd relish all we had to ask or say. We knew the small figure coming home from a distance was him because he had a way of walking. No matter how exhausted he was, there was a bounce to his step. He always came up our apartment stairs, skipping 3 steps at a time, his long black coat opening behind him like a superhero cape, his fiery red beard lighting up the way. When he finally was home on Hanukkah, he had no big box. He entered our apartment empty-handed. He came in all business, ready for the night to commence. Gitten Hanukkah, he'd call out. He claimed not to know of a box that we had seen him walk with outside. What box? He'd shoo us away. Nu schnell, bring the oil, nu. He was impatient, so fixated on getting started that we almost believed him. We stood by shyly as he tied his belt over his long coat, put on his tall black hat, and let out a sing-song rendition of the night's blessing. Baruch atah. He danced the muezzur with the boys and reached into his pants pocket to pull out a quarter for each of us in order of age. If we were after bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, we got $1. And then he sat into his comfortable dining room chair, facing his large silver menorah. He would sit there for a while and watch the little flames sway against the silver corks that kept them afloat. His big square glasses reflected gorgeous yellow light. At last, we could let a breath out. We could eat chocolate Hanukkah gelt and mashed potatoes coated in crispy cornflakes crumbs. How I loved that. Only then did my father finally call one of the older ones over to him. He whispered something. The lucky one who had been called over ran out the door without bothering to pull on a coat, and back he came with a box. My father oohed and ahed as he opened it. Who would have guessed it? It was a stereo. It was an upgrade, too. Last year's edition didn't have a CD player. Last year's edition, you couldn't put one speaker in the kitchen where my mother worked and another in the bedroom where we spent days in the most boring job on earth folding everyone's laundry. Last year's wasn't this big. This was twice as big. Wow, he'd say again and again. Wow. And his enthusiasm shone back in all our eyes. But as a matter of course, while he took off his hat and coat, rolled up his sleeves, and pulled wires and wrapping out of the box, he grabbed a pair of pliers, and with a swoop, he cut the stereo antenna off at its base. I was so used to this, I almost expected it to be part of the stereo setup instructions. Remove wrapping, mash silver, expandable stick, continue setup, etc., etc., etc. The nasty nub that the procedure left could easily slit open human skin, and that too we took for granted as par for the course for a state-of-the-art stereo. We just tried not to get any open wounds while we put in our favorite cassette and hit play. Those were the highlights of my childhood. I grew up with ubiquitous censorship. It was there for all of us to see, and yet there was so much else to see, for instance in that stereo, that I didn't actually see it. I knew that the stereo had a broken antenna, and so it was. I knew our school textbook had whole pages missing, but what had been ripped out by the censoring ladies just didn't exist to me. And of those pages that remained, black harsh markings were ever present. I would sometimes scratch off the black crayon, hold the pages with permanent marker to the light, trying to see. I felt a tingling of hunger for the forbidden. Under the black, I made out words that made no sense but were titillating nonetheless, like millions of years and dinosaurs and sex. When we drove to visit our grandparents in Williamsburg, we bounced around in a 15-passenger van and drove past a flood of city lights and looming billboards. We called this part of our journey the Goyische Neujahr, the Gentile city. This was the part we were supposed to not see. I often got carsick, and I looked out the window feeling vaguely nauseous and dazzled and overwhelmed. Whatever I saw in the great city made a dizzying fever dream of psychedelic world that existed far into my periphery. Soon enough, we were in the Yiddische Neujahr, the Hasidic enclave right off the Williamsburg Bridge, and then it was all digestible again. I didn't understand the outside world, but I understood the life I did live. of running along Lefkowitz's yard to climb through the hole in the fence behind their house to get to my best friend's house that was on the other side of their lawn. I knew how to play kick the can and knot it and lamination with a ball for hours and hours until we were angrily called home by older siblings. I knew mischief and good behavior, weddings and funerals, holidays and fasts, the humdrum of the very ritualized world of Curious Joel. I didn't realize this stereo was broken or consider why until the 11th grade. One day, early in the new school year of my 11th grade, an enormous buzz rippled through our 300-girl classroom, our 300-girl lunchroom. We would all gather every morning in the lunchroom for breakfast and prayers. It was a very big lunchroom that was also a wedding venue where I got married. Something unfathomable had happened, something unbelievable. It was said that airplanes crashed into the Twin Towers, into both. I was 16 and thought it sounded like a Baba Misa, a wives' tale. Not the Twin Towers that loomed so large and permanent and incredible over the Goyische Neujahr. It couldn't be. And then the principal appeared. We all fell silent, all 300 of us, and we were ordered to start reciting psalms in unison. In that moment of my young adulthood, on the morning of September 11th, the walls that separated us in Curious Joel from the larger society of the United States became more porous. All of us in Curious Joel, in our little village, were now part of the global happenings. Helicopters buzzed overhead and we thought we could smell smoke. Yet we had no television, we had no internet. We had to wait for the following morning for the Yiddish newspaper to print in order to read our media on it. But the night of September 11, my father brought home printouts from his computer from the secular news, and it was the first taste I had of this new hunger for news. That's how I found out about the radio. The radio that had always been snipped, cut, disappeared. My neighbor Rosie and I were sitting on the slope of our front lawn shortly after September 11, watching the helicopters and praying that this may not be another Holocaust. As we talked, she told me about what was happening, she gave me updates on the news. We had never been close like that she would tell me about the secular news. Not until then. Because she was of a different class. Her family was more stylish, more worldly, more modern, perhaps a little more affluent. Her family's home was more adorned. They spoke more English. They listened to something she called 880 for weather predictions. She told me she'd heard on 880 that there would be war. I asked her where was this 880. She said it was the radio. I asked her where she heard the radio, and she said on a tape recorder. I was confused. Then it sunk in. I understood. I understood the antenna, the silver pokey thing, the terrifying static sound that the stereo made if you mistakenly switched from CD to AM and FM. I put it together. AM and FM on our Walkmans were not some adaptation of AM and PM for time. They were the radio. I had a small Sony Walkman for playing kosher cassettes. All along, it had the radio on it, the antenna built in. I could not make out what they were saying on public radio when I tuned in. It was just too fast and the English was too difficult. I tried to listen, I remember, to NPR and I just couldn't understand. But I fell in love with talk radio, with raging, angry, right-wing men who seemed radical and anti-authoritarianism and brilliant and know-it-all from where I was. How I drank in that little pleasure, this little secret. I felt like I had, in my unbroken antenna, found true enlightenment. This too was the highlight of my youth. I enjoy to look back at all the innocent joys I've had, at how naive and hungry I was, at how easily satiated, how little I knew of what I didn't know at all stages. For a while there, with my little Walkman under my floral bedspread, I thought I knew everything. To me, the right-wing radio men of the forbidden channels had all the answers. It would take many years to figure out a larger picture. Many, many years in a long journey of an arranged marriage, motherhood, so much suffering and heartache. But when I light the menorah today, my life in such a different place, and I reflect on what's been, I treasure the memories of those times when knowing only a little was enough. I wish you all a happy Hanukkah.